Today, we reveal 20 chilling secrets of old Hollywood stars, only discovered after their deaths. These are the hidden truths the studios buried, the scandals too explosive for their time, and the private lives masked by million-dollar smiles. From secret affairs with presidents to double lives kept in the shadows, this is the dark side of fame they never wanted you to see. Stay with us, because one of these revelations will forever change how you see a Hollywood legend. Marilyn Monroe, the icon whose silence echoed louder than her fame. She was the ultimate image of glamour, platinum blonde hair, breathy voice, and a smile that sold a million fantasies. But behind the camera, Marilyn Monroe was caught in a quiet storm. Her tragic death in 1962 was ruled a simple ending, but it was anything but simple. What followed wasn't just mourning, it was suspicion, secrets, and whispers from behind closed doors. It wasn't until decades later that the world would begin to peel back the layers. Government documents surfaced showing she had drawn the attention of federal agencies. Her private conversations were monitored. Her close ties to powerful political figures, including one who lived in the White House, suddenly cast her story in a new light. The glowing starlet America adored had apparently become a liability. For years, theories swirled, some outlandish, others uncomfortably plausible. But what's undeniable is this: Marilyn knew things she wasn't supposed to know, and she said things others hoped she'd forget. She didn't. And in the end, the most enduring symbol of Hollywood's golden age left us with a mystery so tangled in power, fame, and silence that it's still unraveling today. Rock Hudson, the heartthrob with a hidden life. To the world, Rock Hudson was the perfect leading man, tall, handsome, the face of romantic cinema. His smile graced magazine covers, and his roles helped define the masculine ideal of the 1950s. But Hudson carried a truth so fragile, it lived behind locked doors and scripted interviews. When he passed away in 1985, the official cause was illness, but what came next shook the world. For the first time, the public learned of his double life, one built not out of deceit, but out of fear. Hollywood at the time wasn't a place that welcomed authenticity if it clashed with the image being sold. And Hudson's image? Untouchable. His death marked more than the loss of star. It broke a cultural silence. It brought conversations into daylight that had been relegated to shadows for decades. In a strange way, Rock Hudson became a pioneer, not just for who he was, but for what he revealed in leaving. A man forced to hide, who finally told the truth without ever speaking a word. Natalie Wood, the star who left behind a question mark. There's something haunting about a mystery that refuses to rest. Natalie Wood was a beloved actress with a career that stretched from childhood stardom to mature, powerful roles. But it wasn't her talent that kept her name in headlines decades later. It was her final night alive. A boat, a few close companions, and then silence. The original investigation offered little clarity. Conflicting accounts, missing time, and a stillness on the water that offered no witness. What truly happened that night became a point of obsession for both the press and the public. But it wasn't until many years later that new voices came forward, sparking a reinvestigation. Her case, once closed, was suddenly reopened. The man she shared that boat with, a household name himself, found his name back in the conversation. And the whispers grew louder. Even now, the story remains unresolved, like a reel of film stuck on the final frame. Natalie Wood's legacy as an actress is forever immortalized in film. But her final chapter, filled with tension and unanswered questions, remains one of Hollywood's most enduring and unsettling enigmas. James Dean, the rebel without a script. James Dean lived fast and, fittingly, became a legend just as quickly. In life, he was electricity, untamed, stylish, unknowable. And then, at just 24, he was gone. His image remained: leather jackets, squinting eyes, a voice that sounded like it had just discovered its own pain. But what lingered behind that rebel persona was a personal truth few knew in his lifetime. After his death, those closest to him began to speak, carefully and often in metaphor. The studio system had cultivated his image as a heartthrob for women, but Dean's private world was more complex. Friendships blurred into something deeper. Hollywood, unwilling to let its icons exist outside rigid categories, turned a blind eye. Or worse, turned the truth into a threat. But the real story of James Dean isn't just about who he loved. It's about a young man who was told to hide essential parts of himself while being praised for his ability to be real on screen. The cruel irony of that never left those who knew him. And so the rebel remains, not just without a cause, but without a full story, at least not one the world was ready to hear at the time. Judy Garland, the girl who couldn't go home. She danced down the yellow brick road and into our hearts, a symbol of hope and wonder for generations. But Judy Garland's off-screen journey was far from magical. From her earliest days in show business, she was handled like a product, not a person. The moment she became valuable, she stopped being protected. After her death, memoirs and confessions cracked open the glittering facade. As a teenager under contract, she was given pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to keep going. Her weight was scrutinized publicly and controlled privately. And all the while, she smiled, because that's what stars were trained to do. What emerged in the years after her passing wasn't just a tragic tale, it was a revelation. Judy wasn't just one woman crushed under fame. She was a symbol of a system designed to devour its brightest lights. Her voice, so full of longing, suddenly seemed prophetic. "There's no place like home," she sang, and maybe that's because she never really had one. Clark Gable, the king with a secret air. He was the king of Hollywood, charming, rugged, the very definition of the American leading man. But Clark Gable's legacy includes a chapter hidden for decades, involving a child he never acknowledged in public, and a co-star who bore the burden alone. During the filming of a light-hearted romance, Gable and actress Loretta Young shared more than chemistry. Months later, she disappeared from the spotlight, a move masked as a vacation, but in reality, it was where she gave birth to their daughter. In an era when reputations could collapse with a whisper, she felt she had no choice. The child was raised in secrecy, told she was adopted. Gable never spoke publicly of her. It wasn't until years after both had passed that the full truth came forward, a revelation that sent shockwaves through Hollywood history. For a man whose screen persona was so deeply tied to fatherly strength, the silence surrounding his real-life fatherhood speaks volumes. The king had his crown, but left behind a daughter who only learned the truth long after his story was believed to be complete. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who hid behind a smile. On screen, Errol Flynn was the embodiment of charm, swords in hand, laughter in his voice, the eternal rogue with a devil-may-care grin. But behind the curtain, the world he navigated was far more shadowed. Known for his flamboyant lifestyle, Flynn lived like the rules didn't apply to him, and for the most part they didn't. But the real story began to unfold after his death. Files that had long sat in silence began to speak, official documents, private accounts, and biographical details that painted a picture at odds with the one seen in theaters. There were powerful connections, strange affiliations, and circles he moved in that seemed more like secret societies than social scenes. His life, once considered glamorous, suddenly appeared tangled with manipulation, whispered deals, and a kind of recklessness that crossed more than just moral boundaries. Errol Flynn lived fast and never apologized. But the truth that emerged later suggested he wasn't just playing a rogue. He might have been hiding from something deeper. Something no amount of fame, wealth, or adventure could quite outrun. Montgomery Clift, the beautiful tragedy of the screen's most haunted soul. Montgomery Clift never acted, he exposed. His performances weren't crafted, they were raw nerves on display. But while the world praised his authenticity, few realized how much he was hiding. Clift lived with a storm inside him, navigating fame with a sensitivity that bordered on unbearable. After his passing, those who had shielded him began to open up. He had lived quietly with secrets that could have destroyed his career in his time. His personal life, filled with complex love, quiet longing, and inner conflict, remained locked away, hidden behind one of Hollywood's most expressive faces. His pain wasn't performative. It was real. Friends described him as tortured, not by external failure, but by an internal war that never ceased. The very traits that made him great on screen, vulnerability, truth, intensity, were the same ones that made life off-screen difficult to endure. In death, Montgomery Clift became more than an actor. He became a symbol of what it cost to feel too much in a world that demanded masks. Spencer Tracy, the devotion that dared not speak its name. Spencer Tracy was the quiet storm of classic Hollywood, powerful, reserved, emotionally magnetic. He played fathers, leaders, and men of integrity. Yet his most enduring role may have been the one never seen on screen, a decades-long romance with Katharine Hepburn that existed entirely in the shadows. It wasn't until long after his passing that Hepburn finally confirmed what many had suspected. They had loved each other deeply, but Tracy, bound by faith, guilt, and a complicated home life, refused to leave his marriage. Their relationship became a ghost that followed them both, ever present, never acknowledged. For over 25 years, Hepburn stood by him, not in official photos or press interviews, but in the quiet places in between. His final days were spent with her by his side, yet even then, the world was kept at arm's length from the truth. Only in death could the full story be told, not just of a forbidden love, but of a loyalty so strong, it endured through silence, sacrifice, and time. A love story too real for the silver screen. Greta Garbo, the star who spoke through silence. Greta Garbo became famous for wanting to be left alone, but few understood what she was really trying to protect. The Swedish-born actress captivated audiences with her mystery, her elegance, and her refusal to play the Hollywood publicity game. While other stars paraded themselves in front of cameras, Garbo slipped quietly into seclusion. But after her passing, letters and journals began to surface, fragments of a woman the public never truly knew. They revealed private relationships that defied the conventions of her era, quiet romances that she kept away from flashing bulbs and studio gossip. She wasn't running from fame, she was guarding her truth. Her silence, once seen as aloofness, became something else entirely, a shield. In a time when deviation from expected could end a career, Garbo carved out her own path. Fiercely private, emotionally complex, and defiantly independent. In the end, she left behind not scandal but reverence. Her greatest role wasn't on film, it was the act of surviving Hollywood without surrendering her soul. Sal Mineo, the forgotten star who lived in the margins. In Rebel Without a Cause, Sal Mineo played the outsider, vulnerable, intense, desperate to belong. In real life, he was no different. Sal soared to fame early, but struggled to maintain control over a narrative he never wrote. He lived a double life in an industry that allowed no space for authenticity beyond the script. After his passing, more of Sal's story came to light. He had quietly lived outside the narrow boxes Hollywood demanded its men fit into. Typecast as the sensitive misfit, he longed for roles with depth, but also for a world where he could be more than just a character actor hiding his truth. His personal world was rich with creativity, but tinged with isolation. As others went on to long careers, Sal faded into the edges, working, writing, dreaming, but never fully accepted. Only years later would Hollywood begin to re-examine his legacy, realizing he was ahead of his time. In the margins where he once lived, a fuller picture finally emerged, not of a rebel, but of a man simply trying to be himself. Hedy Lamarr, the beauty who invented the future. She was once called the most beautiful woman in the world, a title that both elevated and diminished her. Audiences adored Hedy Lamarr for her exotic looks and mysterious screen presence, but the world had no idea what else she carried in her mind. It wasn't until long after her death that the full scope of her genius was recognized. During the height of World War II, Hedy quietly co-invented a communication system designed to protect Allied torpedoes from interception, a concept that would later form the foundation of modern wireless technology. Her invention, however, was ignored in its time. Why? Perhaps because it didn't fit the narrative. A Hollywood actress couldn't also be a technological visionary, at least not in the eyes of the men who controlled both industries. And so, the idea was shelved uncredited and nearly forgotten. But time has a way of correcting history. Today, Hedy Lamarr is remembered not just for her face, but for her mind, a mind that helped shape the world we live in, all while being underestimated by the one she tried to survive in. Bette Davis, the legend whose greatest role may have been off-screen. Bette Davis didn't just act, she commanded. With eyes that could cut glass and a voice that dripped with disdain or tenderness at will, she was Hollywood's storm in heels. But the greatest drama of her life wasn't filmed, it was written by her own daughter. Years after Davis's death, her daughter released a memoir that shattered illusions. The pages weren't tributes, they were indictments. Allegations of coldness, control, and emotional torment flooded the public consciousness. Fans were torn. Was it the bitter voice of a child chasing her own spotlight, or a long-buried truth about a woman who played her roles too well? Even at home, the portrait painted was far from flattering. But as with all great performances, the truth was likely more complicated. Davis, after all, was a woman in a man's world, fierce, intelligent, and unwilling to be quiet. And the cost of that resistance may have echoed into her personal life. What remains is a legacy split down the middle, a powerhouse on screen, and off it, perhaps a force too large for those closest to her to survive unscathed. Elizabeth Taylor, the diamond with a hidden light. Elizabeth Taylor lived like few others dared, a woman of extremes, passions, and endless reinvention. She married 8 times, battled illness, wore jewels worth kingdoms, and lit up every room she entered. But after her death, it was revealed that her brightest contributions had nothing to do with movies. In secret, Taylor had become one of the earliest and fiercest advocates for those suffering in silence. At a time when many stars fled controversy, she stepped into it. She held fundraisers when others held their tongues. She used her fame not just to entertain, but to challenge indifference. She gave away millions but told few. She visited hospitals under no press lights, comforted strangers, and called world leaders directly, not for herself, but for others. It wasn't charity, it was mission. Her legacy, once defined by glamour, suddenly deepened. The violet-eyed beauty who had captivated generations had, in quiet defiance, used her voice when it mattered most, and only after she was gone did the world truly begin to hear it. Peter Lorre, the face that watched the watchers. Peter Lorre's image was unforgettable, wide eyes, weary voice, the embodiment of noir unease. Audiences saw him as sinister, haunted, otherworldly. But few suspected that in real life, he was being watched as closely as any of the characters he played. After his death, once classified files confirmed what he never admitted: he had been under surveillance by government agencies. In the anxious era of ideological paranoia, even eccentricity could draw suspicion. And Lorre, with his past in Europe and his social circles in Hollywood, was considered interesting and perhaps dangerous. He lived much of his career in a fog of typecasting, rarely given roles that reflected his depth or intelligence. Behind the scenes, he was well-read, thoughtful, and often frustrated. The system that made him famous also boxed him in, as both an actor and a citizen. In the end, the most chilling realization isn't that Peter Lorre played men under pressure. It's that he was one, smiling, performing, and always wondering who might be listening. Ingrid Bergman, the star who refused to apologize. Ingrid Bergman was Hollywood's golden girl, elegant, intelligent, and universally adored. That all changed with one choice. She fell in love, deeply, publicly, with an Italian director while still married. The backlash was swift and brutal. Overnight, she went from beloved to condemned. She was denounced on the Senate floor. Studios turned cold. For years, she lived and worked in exile, branded a fallen woman in a town built on illusions. But what the world saw as scandal, she saw as freedom. She had chosen love, art, and truth over image. Decades later, when she returned to Hollywood, it wasn't with an apology, it was with power. She walked back into the spotlight with awards, applause, and the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. In retrospect, her real offense wasn't infidelity, it was independence. In a time when women were expected to behave, Ingrid Bergman misbehaved brilliantly, and in doing so, became one of the first modern stars to live on her own terms. Jean Harlow, the platinum dream cut short. Jean Harlow was Hollywood's first blonde bombshell, ethereal, electric, and impossibly young. She was only 26 when her life ended suddenly, stunning fans and leaving the industry in stunned silence. The cause, at the time, was wrapped in confusion and euphemisms. But the truth didn't surface until much later. Behind her studio-made glow was a young woman battling an illness few recognized and fewer treated properly. In an age before accurate diagnostics and open medical conversations, her declining health was chalked up to exhaustion or nerves. The studios, fearful of lost profits, pushed her onward. It wasn't until years later that medical histories revealed the depth of her condition. She wasn't fading from a spotlight. She was fighting for her life in its blinding glare. The girl who seemed untouchable had been deeply vulnerable, and no one saw it until it was too late. Jean Harlow's death became one of Hollywood's earliest cautionary tales. A reminder that beneath the image, beneath the shimmer, was someone real, and far too young to be left behind. Rita Hayworth, the screen siren, lost in the fog. To millions, Rita Hayworth was the face of desire, Gilda herself, tossing her hair and capturing hearts with a single look. But her final years told a quieter, more heartbreaking story. As time wore on, the vibrant icon began to fade, and no one could explain why. It wasn't until after her death that the truth came into focus. She had spent her final years battling a degenerative condition that clouded her memory and unraveled her thoughts. For years, her symptoms had been misunderstood, even ridiculed. Friends thought she was drinking too much. Studios thought she was unreliable. In reality, she was slipping away, slowly, painfully, and in full view of a world that didn't understand what it was seeing. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't glamorous. It was simply human. Rita Hayworth, the woman once immortalized in celluloid fire, left behind more than just great films. She left a legacy of compassion and a reminder that even stars can lose their way in the dark. Marlon Brando, the titan with a tangled heart. Marlon Brando didn't just transform acting, he detonated it. A hurricane of raw emotion and electric unpredictability, he set the screen on fire every time he appeared. But behind that force of nature was a man far more complex than the public ever realized. After his death, a cascade of stories emerged. Friends, family, and biographies revealed a deeply emotional, often tortured man who lived with contradictions, a fierce advocate for justice, a chaotic father, a man of deep empathy and unpredictable choices. His relationships spanned the spectrum of connection, his passions resisted labels, and his home life was a tangle of joy and sorrow. He wasn't hiding, he was protecting. Protecting his privacy, his family, and perhaps even his own ability to keep working in an industry that demanded easy labels. Brando left behind more than just unforgettable roles. He left behind a puzzle, one that still doesn't have all its pieces and perhaps never will. George Reeves, the man of steel with feet of clay. To generations of children, George Reeves was Superman, a living emblem of truth, justice, and the American way. But once the cape came off, his life was marked by frustration, stifled ambition, and a longing to be taken seriously. After his sudden passing, questions circled. Official reports claimed one thing, but many who knew him claimed another. Theories ranged from plausible to cinematic. What's clear is that Reeves was deeply unhappy with how the industry saw him, not as an actor but as a brand. Superman made him famous, but it also trapped him. In the years following his death, the story took on a life of its own. Books, investigations, and even films attempted to understand what had gone so wrong for a man who seemed so right to so many. George Reeves remains a symbol, not of invincibility, but of the fragility beneath our heroes. A reminder that even icons wear masks, and sometimes they hide more than we know. Behind every spotlight, there is shadow. And for these 20 old Hollywood legends, the stories that emerged after their passing weren't meant to scandalize, they were meant to humanize. These stars were more than their roles, more than their carefully polished public images. They were artists, fighters, dreamers, and sometimes people quietly at war with the very system that made them icons. In telling these stories, we're not just digging into the past, we're uncovering truths that still matter today. Stories of identity, silence, power, resilience, and the price of fame. They remind us that legacy is rarely straightforward, and that even the brightest stars can carry the heaviest burdens. If one of these stories moved you, surprised you, or made you see a familiar face in a new way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know which star's story stayed with you the most, or share your own perspective on the legends of Hollywood's golden age. And if you'd like to see more deep dives into forgotten chapters of history, film, and fame, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that made the screen, but the ones that were hidden behind it.